Robert
This doesn't
Williams was
make any
78 years
sense.
old
We
and
need to
had owned
figure
his
this out
house
now.
on Northeast
No,
Alberta
this
Street in
can't be
Portland,
right.
Oregon for 49 years when the real estate agents from Cascade Property Solutions knocked on his door on the afternoon of March 12, 2019. With their rehearsed smiles and their leather portfolios and their practiced speech about how his neighborhood was declining and his house was losing value, and he should sell immediately before the market collapsed completely, and Robert listened. To them standing on his front porch with the March rain falling softly around them, because he'd been raised to be polite to people even when something felt wrong. Even when his instincts were telling him that these well-dressed young people with their expensive cars parked at his curb and their confident voices weren't actually trying to help him, but rather were trying to take something from him. The house at 4247 Northeast Alberta Street was a modest two-bedroom bungalow that Robert and his late wife Martha had purchased in 1970 for $18,000, a price that had seemed enormous and slightly terrifying to a young black couple in their late 20s who were just starting their lives together. Robert working as a machinist at a Northwest Portland manufacturing plant and Martha working as a nurse at a manual hospital, both of them saving every spare dollar for years to accumulate the down payment. They'd raised their two children in that house, had painted every room multiple times over the decades, had replaced the roof twice and the furnace once, and had gradually transformed the small backyard into Martha's garden sanctuary, where she'd grown tomatoes and peppers and flowers until the cancer had taken her 5 years ago. Leaving Robert alone in the house they'd shared for 44 years with only his memories and his routines and his slowly progressing dementia that made some days clearer than others and some memories sharper than the present moment. Robert was a Korean War veteran who'd served in the Army, had been stationed near the 38th parallel during some of the war's most brutal winter fighting, had seen things he'd never spoken about to anyone, including Martha, had come home with frostbite scars on his hands and nightmares that had faded slowly over decades, but had never completely disappeared. He'd worked at the manufacturing plant for 42 years, and he'd taken early retirement at age 68. His pension modest, but combined with Social Security and Martha's survivor benefits from her nursing career, giving him just enough to maintain the house and pay his bills and live quietly. He had no mortgage. They'd paid off the house completely in 1994 after 24 years of monthly payments. And property taxes on his modest bungalow were manageable even on his fixed income, and he'd been content with his routines of morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks around the neighborhood when his knees cooperated, evening television, weekly phone calls with his daughter in Sacramento and his son in Seattle who both had their own families and their own struggles and couldn't visit as often as any of them would have liked. But over the past year, Robert had noticed his memory becoming less reliable, had noticed himself forgetting appointments and repeating stories and sometimes losing track of what day it was or whether he'd already taken his blood pressure medication that morning. And his children had noticed during their phone calls and had gently suggested he might want to see a doctor about it. And the doctor had eventually diagnosed early-stage dementia, had explained that it would progress slowly and that Robert could still live independently for now, but would eventually need more support and care. Robert had told his children about the diagnosis during their next phone calls, and they both said they'd try to visit more often and they'd start looking into options for future care. But in the meantime, Robert was managing, was still mostly himself, was still living in the house he'd shared with Martha for so long. The Alberta Street neighborhood had changed dramatically over the past decade in ways that Robert found both fascinating and disturbing. What had been a predominantly black working-class neighborhood for generations, a place where Robert and Martha had raised their children among neighbors who looked like them and shared similar experiences and economic situations, had become what people called gentrified, a term Robert had learned meant that wealthy, mostly white people were moving in, that coffee shops charging $5 for a cup of coffee were replacing the corner stores where Robert had bought his groceries for 40 years, that property values were skyrocketing as developers bought up older homes and either renovated them into expensive showpieces or tore them down completely to build modern houses that sold for prices Robert could barely comprehend. His next-door neighbors of 30 years, the Johnson family, had sold their house 2 years ago for $380,000 and had moved to Gresham, where housing was cheaper, and the new owners who'd moved in were a young white couple who worked in tech and who'd renovated extensively, and who were perfectly pleasant when Robert saw them, but who didn't sit on their porch in the evenings the way the Johnsons had, didn't know the neighborhood history, existed in a completely different economic reality than the one Robert inhabited. The real estate agents from Cascade Property Solutions had been coming to Robert's door every few weeks since January. Always polite, always persistent, always with the same basic message delivered in slightly different variations. The neighborhood was changing, longtime residents like Robert were being pushed out, property taxes were going to increase dramatically, and he wouldn't be able to afford them on his fixed income. His house was old and needed expensive repairs he couldn't afford. He should sell now while he still could before the market turned and before his house became worthless, and Cascade Property Solutions would be happy to make him a fair cash offer and handle all the paperwork and make the whole process easy and stress-free. They'd offered him $50,000 for his house in February, had emphasized that it was a generous offer given the house's age and condition, had told him he should take it before the offer expired and before he lost even that small amount of value. Robert had told them no repeatedly, had said the house wasn't for sale, that he'd lived there for 49 years and intended to stay until he died. But the agents kept coming back with new arguments and new pressure tactics. And on this March 12th visit, they'd brought what they called a professional appraisal showing that his house was worth only $55,000 at most, showing photographs of foundation cracks and roof damage and outdated electrical systems, telling him that major repairs would cost far more than the house was worth, that he'd be better off selling to them for $50,000 cash and finding a nice apartment somewhere cheaper. One of the agents, a young man named Derek who couldn't have been more than 30 years old, had said with practiced sympathy that it must be so hard for Robert to maintain this big old house by himself at his age, that surely it would be easier and less stressful to let them handle everything and move somewhere more manageable, somewhere with fewer stairs and less yard work. Robert had felt confused and pressured standing there on his porch with these confident young people telling him his house was nearly worthless, even though he'd heard from neighbors that similar houses on his street were selling for $400,000 or more. But his dementia made him doubt his own memory and knowledge, made him wonder if maybe they were right, and he was confused, made him feel like he should probably just trust these professional real estate people who seemed to know what they were talking about. He'd told them he needed time to think about it, that he wanted to talk to his children, and they'd said of course, but they needed an answer soon because the offer wouldn't stay on the table forever, and they'd left him with paperwork to sign if he decided to accept, paperwork that had blank spaces for the sale price and closing date and other details that made Robert's head hurt when he tried to read through it all. What Robert didn't know as he stood on his porch that rainy March afternoon, watching the real estate agents drive away in their expensive SUV, was that his next-door neighbor Maria Gonzalez, the 28-year-old Latino woman who'd moved in 3 months ago, and who Robert had spoken with a few times in passing when they were both checking their mail or taking out trash, had been watching the entire interaction from her living room window, had seen the agent's body language and Robert's confused, uncertain posture, had noticed this was the 3rd or 4th time she'd seen these same agents at Robert's door, and had felt her lawyer instincts screaming that something was very wrong with this situation. Maria Gonzalez had graduated from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland just 18 months earlier, had passed the Oregon bar exam on her first attempt, and was currently working as a public defender in Multnomah County, while also doing occasional pro bono work through a legal aid clinic that served low-income clients and vulnerable populations. She'd grown up in a working-class Mexican immigrant family in Southeast Portland, had been the first person in her extended family to attend college and then law school, had financed her education through a combination of scholarships and loans, and working multiple jobs simultaneously, and had gone into law specifically because she'd watched her own parents and grandparents and neighbors be taken advantage of by landlords and employers and businesses that knew immigrant families and working class people often didn't know their legal rights or couldn't afford lawyers to defend those rights. She'd moved to the Alberta Street neighborhood specifically because she wanted to live in a diverse working-class area rather than in the expensive, trendy neighborhoods where many of her law school classmates had chosen to settle, and she'd been disturbed by how quickly and aggressively gentrification was displacing the Black families who'd built the neighborhood's culture and community over generations. Maria had noticed Robert Williams immediately when she'd moved in because he was often sitting on his porch in the mornings drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, and she'd introduced herself, and they'd had several pleasant conversations where Robert had told her about the neighborhood's history, about how different things had been when he and Martha had first moved in, about the families who'd lived on the block for decades and had recently sold and moved away. She'd also noticed that Robert sometimes seemed confused during their conversations, would repeat himself or lose track of what they'd been discussing, and she'd wondered privately if he might be experiencing some cognitive decline, which made her extra vigilant about anyone who might try to take advantage of him. When Maria saw the real estate agents at Robert's door for what she was certain was at least the third time in 2 months, saw their aggressive, confident postures and Robert's uncertain body language, saw them hand him paperwork before leaving, she'd made a decision immediately. She'd waited until the agents had driven away, had walked over to Robert's house and knocked on his door, and when Robert had answered looking tired and confused and slightly overwhelmed, she'd asked gently if he was okay and if those people had been bothering him. Robert had said they were real estate agents who wanted to buy his house, but he wasn't sure what to do, that they said it was only worth $50,000 and he should sell before it became completely worthless. And Maria had felt cold anger settling in her stomach because she knew exactly what was happening here, had studied elder financial exploitation in law school, had prosecuted cases involving predatory real estate practices during her brief time working at the district attorney's office before switching to public defense. Maria had asked Robert if she could look at the paperwork the agents had left, and Robert had invited her inside and had shown her the documents. And Maria had spent 20 minutes reading through everything while Robert made tea and explained haltingly that he'd owned the house for 49 years and didn't really want to sell, but maybe these young people were right that he should, because they seemed to know what they were talking about, and he didn't want to be a burden to his children if the house became too expensive to maintain. Maria had found multiple red flags in the paperwork. The purchase agreement had blank spaces for essential terms. The appraisal appeared to be completely fabricated with photographs that might not even be of Robert's house. The company's business license number didn't match any registered Oregon real estate firm she could find in the state database on her phone. And most damningly, the purchase price of $50,000 was roughly 1/10 of the actual market value of homes in this rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. Maria had explained to Robert as clearly and simply as she could that the real estate agents were lying to him, that his house was worth at least $400,000 and possibly closer to $500,000 based on recent comparable sales in the neighborhood, that they were trying to trick him into selling for a fraction of its value so they could immediately resell it for enormous profit, that this was called elder financial exploitation and was both unethical and illegal, and that she would help him for free if he wanted her to because this was exactly the kind of predatory behavior she'd become a lawyer to fight against. Robert had looked stunned and then angry and then relieved all within the span of 30 seconds, had said he'd known something felt wrong but hadn't trusted his own judgment because of his memory problems, had asked Maria if she was sure she could help him because he couldn't afford to pay a lawyer. Maria had told Robert she would represent him pro bono, meaning free of charge, because this case made her furious, and because helping an elderly veteran avoid being scammed by predatory real estate developers was exactly why she'd chosen public interest law over the corporate firm jobs that paid six-figure salaries but required defending banks and corporations instead of actual people who needed help. Over the next week, Maria had conducted extensive research into Cascade Property Solutions and had discovered they were part of a network of companies operating throughout Portland targeting elderly homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods, using high-pressure tactics and fraudulent appraisals and misleading purchase agreements to acquire properties for far below market value. She'd found at least 15 similar cases in the past 2 years where elderly residents had sold their homes to various companies connected to the same ownership group for prices ranging from $40,000 to $70,000. Properties that had then been renovated and resold within months for $300,000 to $500,000, generating obscene profits for the developers while leaving elderly former owners displaced and often homeless because the small amounts they'd received weren't enough to afford housing anywhere in Portland's overheated market. Maria had contacted the Oregon Department of Justice Consumer Protection Division and had filed a formal complaint against Cascade Property Solutions alleging elder financial exploitation and fraudulent business practices, had provided extensive documentation of their targeting of Robert Williams and the fraudulent appraisal and the predatory purchase agreement terms. She'd also researched Robert's house extensively and had obtained legitimate property appraisals showing it was worth approximately $450,000 given the neighborhood's rapid gentrification and the lot size and the house's condition, which while dated was actually quite solid structurally. She'd sent a formal cease and desist letter to Cascade Property Solutions informing them that she was representing Robert Williams, that any further contact with him would be considered harassment, that their fraudulent appraisal and purchase documents had been reported to state authorities, and that if they continued their predatory practices, she would file a lawsuit seeking damages and injunctive relief. The company had responded through their attorney claiming everything had been legitimate business practice and that Robert had been free to accept or reject their offer, but they'd stopped contacting him immediately and had withdrawn their purchase offer. Maria had then filed a civil lawsuit on Robert's behalf in Multnomah County Circuit Court seeking damages for attempted elder financial exploitation and fraud, arguing that the company had deliberately targeted a vulnerable elderly person with diagnosed dementia, had used fraudulent appraisal documents to mislead him about his property's value, and had attempted to acquire his property through deception for roughly 1/10 of its actual worth. The case had attracted significant media attention because it highlighted the intersection of gentrification and elder exploitation, because it involved a Korean War veteran being targeted by predatory developers, and because Maria was able to demonstrate a pattern of similar exploitation targeting other elderly homeowners throughout Northeast Portland's historically black neighborhoods. The lawsuit had proceeded through discovery over the summer and fall of 2019, during which Maria had obtained internal company documents showing that Cascade Property Solutions had specifically targeted elderly homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods, had trained their agents to identify potential cognitive impairment and used that to pressure sales, had created deliberately misleading property valuations to convince owners their homes were worthless, and had developed sophisticated scripts for creating urgency and fear about declining property values and increasing tax burdens. In November 2019, facing overwhelming evidence and negative publicity, Cascade Property Solutions and their parent company had agreed to a settlement requiring them to pay Robert Williams $200,000 in damages and to cease all predatory marketing practices targeting elderly homeowners, and to submit to state oversight and monitoring of their business practices for 5 years. Robert had been stunned by the settlement amount, had initially wanted to refuse it because it seemed like too much money and he didn't want to be greedy. But Maria had explained patiently that this was compensation for the emotional distress they'd caused him and the fraudulent practices they'd engaged in, and was intended partly to punish the company for their predatory behavior and deter similar conduct. She'd helped Robert set up a trust to manage the settlement money, had connected him with elder law attorneys who could help him plan for his eventual care needs as his dementia progressed, had worked with his children to establish a plan for his long-term housing and support that would allow him to stay in his beloved house as long as possible with home health aides and eventually more intensive care if needed. The case had also led to broader impacts beyond just Robert's individual situation. The Oregon legislature had passed new legislation in 2020 strengthening protections against elder financial exploitation in real estate transactions, requiring additional disclosures and cooling-off periods and independent appraisals for any property purchase from owners over age 70. The Attorney General's office had opened investigations into several other real estate companies using similar predatory practices in gentrifying Portland neighborhoods. Multiple news organizations had run investigative series about the intersection of gentrification and elder exploitation, about how elderly longtime residents of rapidly changing neighborhoods were being systematically targeted by developers who saw their confusion and vulnerability as business opportunities. Maria had maintained a relationship with Robert after the case concluded, checking on him regularly, helping him navigate various legal and administrative issues as they arose, becoming something like an adopted granddaughter since his own children lived too far away to visit frequently. Robert had insisted on paying Maria something despite her pro bono representation, and they'd eventually agreed that he'd establish a small scholarship fund at Lewis and Clark Law School for first-generation law students interested in public interest work, a way of paying forward the help he'd received and supporting more young lawyers like Maria who chose to use their legal skills to help vulnerable people rather than to maximize corporate profits. Robert's story had become somewhat famous in Portland's legal community as an example of why pro bono work mattered and why having lawyers willing to fight predatory practices was essential for protecting vulnerable populations, and Maria had been recognized by several legal organizations for her advocacy. But more importantly, Robert had been able to stay in his house on Northeast Alberta Street, had been able to remain in the neighborhood where he'd lived for 49 years and where Martha's Garden still bloomed every summer, had been able to age in place with dignity and appropriate support rather than being displaced by predatory developers who'd seen his dementia as an opportunity for profit rather than as a condition requiring protection and respect. Robert Williams' story reminds us that a 78-year-old Korean War veteran with early-stage dementia was nearly swindled out of a house worth $450,000 by real estate agents who told him it was worthless and offered him $50,000, targeting his cognitive vulnerability with fraudulent appraisals and high-pressure tactics. And he would have lost everything if his neighbor, a 28-year-old lawyer who'd graduated from law school just 18 months earlier, hadn't been watching from her window and hadn't chosen to intervene. Elder financial exploitation is a $3 billion annual crime in America. Predatory real estate companies specifically target elderly homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods, knowing that confusion about rapidly changing property values combined with potential cognitive decline creates perfect conditions for fraud. They use fake appraisals showing properties as worthless, create artificial urgency about declining markets and rising taxes, and exploit the fact that many elderly people trust professionals and don't realize they're being lied to. Robert had served his country in Korea's brutal winter fighting, had worked 42 years as a machinist, had owned his home for 49 years, had done everything right. And developers saw his dementia as a business opportunity. They would have stolen his house, displaced him from his neighborhood, and left him with $50,000 that couldn't buy housing anywhere in Portland, while they resold his property for $450,000 and pocketed $400,000 in profit. But Maria Gonzalez saw what was happening. She was a public defender making modest wages, drowning in law school debt, living next door by chance. She could have looked away. Instead, she spent hundreds of hours on pro bono legal work, filed complaints with state authorities, sued the predatory company, obtained internal documents proving their systematic exploitation of elderly homeowners, and won a $200,000 settlement that punished the company and protected Robert. Her work led to new state legislation protecting elderly sellers and investigations into similar predatory practices throughout Portland. The difference between Robert losing his home and keeping it was one lawyer who happened to be watching out her window and chose to act. That's not heartwarming, it's an indictment. How many elderly homeowners don't have a Maria Gonzalez next door? How many lose their homes to predatory developers every day? How many are displaced from neighborhoods they built while companies profit from their confusion and vulnerability? Like, subscribe, and share if you believe elderly veterans deserve protection from predatory real estate fraud. Join the conversation. Have you or elderly family experienced real estate fraud or high-pressure sales tactics? What happened? Share below. Remember, Robert wasn't incompetent or foolish. He was a Korean War veteran with early dementia being systematically lied to by professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Elder exploitation isn't victims' failure, it's predators' crime. Support elder abuse prevention. Support pro bono legal services. Support laws protecting vulnerable homeowners.